Hi, this is Rabbi Chaim Coffin. Welcome to our 225th installment in the Torah portion of the week. We are holding by Parshas Shelach. Parshas Shelach talks about the spies. Moshe sending out the spies and the bad things they say against the land of Israel. It speaks about the spies' report. Speaks about Israel, the Jewish people being threatened with extermination. God spells out the decree, the libations, a lot here to speak about. The end of the Parsha speaks about Census, right? It speaks about the command of Census. And if we look at chapter 15, verse 39, right, the Torah tells me in the command of Census that it shall constitute Census for you, that you may see it. You remember all the commandments of Hashem, perform them, and not explore after your heart, after your eyes, after which you stray. All right, so here we have a command to seemingly wear your tzitzis out, right? For all men wearing tzitzis, really they should be seen. They should be worn outside, meaning outside your pants. People should see them. And it says, don't go after your heart, after your eyes, right? That is going to cause you to go astray. So the Gemara tells us in Brachos, Tractate Brachot, page 12. What does it mean not to go after your heart? It means minus. What is minus? Minus is heresy. All right, don't let your heart go after heresy. That, God forbid, a person could say, there's no God. He doesn't run the world. God forbid, he doesn't exist. Right? That's heresy. Certainly heresy. Comes along Rashi, and Rashi says, not strive, go after your heart. What does that mean? That is, again, heresy. And he says that what are you going to do? You are going to flip the reasons of the Torah, and you're going to explain it in your own way in order that it's going to be heresy. In other words, you're going to take the Torah, you're going to distort it, basically for your own gain, i.e. to say there are other gods, or whatever this heresy is. Says, Mari v'Rebbe, Arav Agon Ramosh Tar Machlita, should be well. And he brings down Rashi over here, and he says it's an unbelievable thing. Because Rashi's warning you quite a bit. He's warning you double. He says that, what are we worried about? We're worried about the person's going to take the Torah. Maybe he'll learn a little bit of Torah, and he's going to turn it in to these philosophical ideas of heresy, to deny God, and basically think what he wants. Really, what does he want? All right, so my Rebbe explains he's going to turn the Torah in my language. Again, I've said this many times. I want to patent this, so don't patent it, otherwise I'll sue you. And that is, you cannot turn the Torah into a pretzel. But here he's telling you that they're going to turn the Torah around. They're going to uproot it from its original explanation and make their own explanation in order to fit their own world outlook. So the Torah's warning over here, do not go after your hearts, and you should stay away from this heresy. Now, unfortunately, this is very prevalent, and it's very common. Why? Because people have an agenda, right? Everybody has an agenda. You'll say, come on, Rabbi, you also have an agenda. True. Right? My agenda is to give out and explain the Torah, right? The easiest way possible, where people are going to get the proper understanding. That they're not going to get a skewed view of what the Torah says. Because there are plenty of people who don't know how to learn, can't read Hebrew, And they want the Torah to fit their world outlook. Even if the verses they want to explain are far in a way not what the Torah says. Right? I give an example. Book of Exodus, chapter 23, verse 2. The Torah says you have to go after the majority. Right? One of the Roman generals, I think it was Tornus Rufus, asked Rabbi Akiva. He asked the following question. And the question was, according to your Torah, it says you have to go after the majority. So how come you don't go like us? How come you don't go like the Christians? Right? How come you don't do what we do? We're the majority. So Rabbi Akiva answered, when do we go according to the majority? When it's beneficial for us. Meaning, if it's a lie, why would we go after a lie? You know, someone may say, you know what? Most people eat bacon. They like bacon. Okay. But you know what? The Torah says I'm not allowed to eat it. The Torah says I'm not allowed to eat pig. The majority says, for argument's sake, it's good. You should be allowed to eat it. The Torah tells me not that way. So it doesn't matter what the majority out there says. If for us it's for the goods, then we say we go like the majority. Right? In other words, two people come to a rabbinical court. Right? Two rabbis say guilty, one says not guilty. Go after the majority. Right? Why would we go after the majority for bad? You say it's the way of the world. This is what people do. This is how people are. But the Torah says no. The Torah says I'm not allowed to do that. You know, it comes to ribbis. Right? A Jew is not allowed to lend money to another Jew with interest. You can do it. You can lend interest to a non-Jew, but to a Jew he's not allowed to. Right now, the Talmud says this is an interesting thing because it doesn't really make sense. Why not? It doesn't make sense for one very simple reason. And the reason is because this is the way of the world. If I let someone borrow $100, why should I not get 150 back or 110 back? Why should I not make money over here? Person needs the money. He gains by borrowing the money. I gain because I get more money back. Torah says I'm not allowed to do that. But it's the way of the world. Right? You ask any Jew or non-Jew, forget what the Bible says. You just ask them straight, does this make sense? They'll say no. Why in the world can I lend with interest? So the person will say, you know, maybe not so nice. Person really struggling, they need the money. Yeah, tell that to the mafia. We're charging you 20, 30% interest. Person's desperate, they're desperate. But you better pay the money back. You know, otherwise you may look much better, you know, without legs or without arms. So, the reality is, in that case, when we talk about going after the majority, we mention it's going after the majority for good, certainly not for bad. Right, but there's another answer. When do we rely on the majority? We rely on the majority when we have a doubt. So the answer also is, you say in your Torah, says Tornus Rufus to Rabbi Akiva, you say in your Torah you have to go after the majority, go after us. So another answer is we only go after the majority when there's a doubt. Right? When we have a doubt and we're not sure. So then we go after the majority. For instance, we have two pieces of meat. Three pieces of meat in front of me. I know one of them is treif. One of them is not kosher. So I'm allowed to eat the meat. Why? Go after the majority. Right, so the question, can I eat them all at once? Can I eat one after the other? Okay, without going into all that, I'm allowed to eat it. Technically. Why? Go after the majority. So when I have a doubt, I can certainly rely on it. When the difference of opinion among rabbinical authorities, you know, when a question comes in front of a rabbinical court, you go after the majority. But see, we don't have doubts. We, the Jewish people, understand what truth is. We'll rely on this when we have to. But the reality is, by us, in Jewish philosophy, there are no doubts. We don't have any doubts over here. Right? That's one idea. It's not really the main point here. But the idea my Rebbe wants to bring out is something I've seen quite a bit. And that is people try and explain things in the Torah itself without having a clue what the Torah means in order to back up what they want to believe in. Meaning, they distort, Christians are very good at this, they distort what the Torah says, they misrepresent what the Torah says, they mistranslate what the Torah says in order to justify whatever they do. So what's the Torah warning me? Torah warns me I have to understand what the Torah says. I have to understand what the law is. I have to understand how the rabbis learn. How they interpret. It's not for me to learn and say, okay, I know how to read a verse over here. Right? We're relying on them. Even the Christians, whether they admit it or not, they are relying on oral law. Right? At least they have to admit they pick and choose it. Now, we never listen to the rabbis. We have our own scholars. Okay? But that's not true. It's not true they don't rely on us. Why? Because even according to King James is translation. Where did the translation come from? Translation came from the Masoretic text. Masoretic text that everybody knows had vowels. If you open up a Sefer Torah, it's got no vowels. So how would you know how to read it if you didn't have vowels? So where did the Christians learn how to... Where did they learn how to translate? Where did they learn how to get the words over here with vowels? From the rabbis. The rabbis put the vowels in. Because the rabbis put the vowels in, they have to rely on that. So if you tell me, honestly, you pick and choose what the rabbis say, okay. I don't have as big of an issue. But if you say, I never rely on the rabbis, come on. Your Christian scholars would never know how to translate if not for the vowels. Because the translation is based on oral law. So you can have it both ways. But you have to learn the Torah the way it's supposed to be. You go to the commentators. You go to oral law. Right? That's what we have. It's the only thing we have. But if a person wants to misinterpret, it can happen. Right? Torah tells me, let us make man in God's image. Right? In our image. God says, who's we? Right in the book of Genesis, who's we? So Rashi says, God's talking to the heavenly court, showing his humility. Does God have to talk to the heavenly court? See what's going on earth? No. Does he need the heavenly court for anything? No. Right? Created spiritual forces of different things, but doesn't really need them. Showing humility, one explanation. Another explanation is a person could come make a mistake. A person could say, oh look, let us make man. Must be there's more than one God. People will make a mistake. Okay. So let them make a mistake. Right? They have free choice. So if they want to misinterpret, they also have free choice. They'll pay a price. But see, why would a person want to say their own explanation in the verses, go against the rabbis, even though they can't read Hebrew and everything else? Why would they want to do that? Very simple, they have an agenda. When a person has an agenda, you can uproot the Torah from what it says. You can make it up as you go along. You can say, this is the explanation, even if it doesn't make any sense. So this is a scary thought. Because it happens quite often. I'll give another example. Torah tells me, book of Leviticus chapter 18. Right? 18:21 or 22. Right? Let me get the exact quote over here. Chapter 18. 22. You shall not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. It's an abomination. Right? Homosexuality. Now, if you look at the previous verses, 20 verses out of 22 talking about what? Forbidden relationships. And that's what's read on Yom Kippur by Mincha, by the afternoon service. Forbidden relationships. There is a verse also speaks about idolatry. So, someone had mentioned that since there's a connection between the verses, and we know that idolatry is forbidden, then it says no homosexuality, so it must be it's talking about idolatry. Because that's what they used to do by idolatry. But not by idolatry. Right? It shouldn't be forbidden. Or it shouldn't be as forbidden. So I would agree with that up to a point. That it is true. We look at context of the verses. But the problem is, I got 20 other verses that talk about immorality. Talk about forbidden relationships. So if 21 out of 22 of those verses speak about the same thing, how can I uproot the meaning because of one verse? It's a little bit hard to say. I mean, it's impossible to say. Right, the 98% chance it's all talking about the same thing. Immorality. If it's talking about immorality, how can I take one verse and say, no, it's really about that. It really has to do with idolatry. It doesn't come underneath the category of immorality. That's very hard to say. Right now, why would someone want to say that? Makes perfect sense. Because they have their own agenda. And they want to say that homosexuality is not so bad. Right? The punishment by homosexuality is the most severe punishment, just like by desecration of Shabbos. Just like idolatry. Right? Stoning to death. So, if you want to tell me it's not that important, well, punishment is the same for that as well as for Shabbos. Same as idolatry. But how can you take it totally out of context? How can you read 21 other verses or 20 other verses and say this one verse uproots everything? Uproots that explanation. Well, it makes perfect sense why someone may want to do that. Why do I say it makes perfect sense? Because they have an agenda. Once you have an agenda, it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to make logical sense. I can uproot it and say this is what it means. There is such an opinion, probably, not so in vogue today. But there's an opinion about the plagues. That if you look at the Torah itself, God's behind all the plagues. Right? God told Moses what's going to be, and that's what happened. All these different plagues. Now, there is an opinion. Again, not so popular. But there's an opinion. No, we take God out of the picture. And the reason all the miracles happened in Egypt is because Saturn was out of orbit. Now, that goes against chapters and verses of the Torah. The Torah is making clear the miracles that are done by God. The fact that the Egyptian, sorcerers couldn't do a number of these shows that's only God. And they admit this is the finger of God over here. After a while. So we believe God intervenes in history by taking us out from Egypt, which is a pretty big tenet of Jewish thought. So if a lot of the book of Exodus is about that, showing God's power, God's might, why in the world would you believe that Saturn was out of orbit? You can say God made Saturn out of orbit, that's how it happened. But that's not what the Torah says. It's not what the Midrashim say. It's not what the Talmud says. Right? We'll be Karaites for a second. The Torah's black and white. God did it. Period. So why would someone even invoke that idea if they would? Because they have an agenda. because they want to show that God's not in charge. But that's not what the Torah says. This is what leads to heresy. This is what heresy is. And this is what happens when you have an agenda. You take things totally out of context. It's Torah made up in your own mind. And maybe you'll find a few verses, quote unquote, that will support exactly what I say. But it's skewed. And not only that, when you look at what people claim and what the Torah says, it's pretty far-fetched. Right? In many ways. Christians, very good, taking prophets totally out of context. Saying it's a reference to JC here, reference to JC there. And historically, it's inaccurate. Right? It couldn't have been around 600 years ago, earlier or later, or whatever. But they're not bothered by that. They don't care about historical inaccuracies. But they also mistranslate verses because it doesn't fit their world outlook. Right? Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, where it talks about God creating evil. They don't want to say that. Why not? Because they got evil from Mr. S, fallen angel, which we don't believe in. Right? So we say God created evil, not that God is evil, without even going into all that. But they totally have a different translation. Now, why do they have a different translation? Very simple. Doesn't fit their outlook. Goes against everything they believe. So since that is the case, what do? They pass the buck and mistranslate. That's what they do. Because it doesn't fit their agenda. This is what leads to heresy. Because once you start misinterpreting verses, or totally taking the verses out of context, saying, nah, you think that's what it means? Now it means something else. And then it's a total, they're skewing what it means by taking it out of context, right? And not seeing it in proper context. And that leads to heresy. That's why Rashi says, the Talmud tells us, going after your heart leads to heresy. It leads to you making up a whole thing in order to fit your world outlook. Right? In order to do that, someone may take these verses, may want to show they know a little bit, and what are they going to do? Totally take it out of context. Right? That leads to heresy. That is heresy. So a person has to know, they have to understand what the Torah says. They have to understand what the Torah wants from me. Now, if they're against this, they don't think it should be that way, so now they have to be creative. A little bit creative. No, that's not what it means. This is what it means. And then they back it up with other things, which is nonsense. Right? It's absolute nonsense. But why do they do it? Because they want to do what they want. They want to justify what they want to do. They want to have their own agenda. And they want to prove it. That's heresy. We have to keep the Torah as it is. God spoke to Moshe. Moshe passed it down to us. That's it. No variations. But it has to be understood. And if we turn it into a pretzel, my words, that's what it is. And a lie will not sell. Eventually, people may see it for what it is. But if more people believe in the lie, it just gets diluted and more diluted. So yeah, there are a lot of lies out there. I mean, Christianity being one of them. One of the biggest lies that exists in the world. But even so, you say, wow, they're the majority. So to speak, millions of people believe, right, in Christianity, whether they know anything about it or not, doesn't really matter, right? But they so-called believe in it. So lies can sell. When you want to put an agenda forth, and you want people to buy it, you got to make it very convincing. You got to make it very strong. Or you have to keep people ignorant. And when you do that, no one's going to never learn it. So people aren't going to question because they're not allowed to question. They have to have faith. Got to have faith, right? You have to have faith. So the majority of Christians don't know anything. The higher-ups know it's a sham. They just continue to live it. Like, it doesn't make sense. But they built this whole religion around it. Around a lie. Around many lies. All you have to do is be thinking about what the words are being said. This is not a great interpretation over here. These egregious errors. An egregious error you put to sleep. Or you tell people, listen, you're going to find out forever, you got to believe. You scare them enough not to question. Because once they start to question, it's over. They're not going to have answers. And they'll tell you got to pray. They'll tell you got to fast. Tell you these other things. But what they won't tell you is the answer, which they don't have. Because it's all about proving a sham. It's all about having an agenda. And having that agenda, what does it do? It allows me to do what I want by proving a falsehood. By living fantasy. And unfortunately, fantasy sells. But God gave everyone a brain. God gave everyone the ability to discern, to reason. Right? So some people will get out of it because they'll see it's nonsense. They'll see it's foolishness. And even though people put a lot of pressure on them, some of them will give in. Right? And some of them will just say this can't be true. Right? And eventually it leads them to Torah. The ones who are truly seeking. They'll get to Torah. And the vast majority will stay ignorant. Like someone will say, you think for the last 50 years church has lied to me? Yes. They have an agenda. They absolutely have an agenda over here. They want to keep people in the dark. So here, we have to be very careful not to make up different ideas, go against the Torah, go against what God wants, and God forbids would make us into heretics. I want to remind everyone I give a class on duties of the heart every Tuesday, 9 o'clock New York time. We're in the Gate of Repentance, chapter 10. I do 2 Q&As every Tuesday, Thursday, 9 o'clock New York time. 10 o'clock New York time, 5 o'clock Israel time. I have a class on Book of Leviticus, chapter 14, every Sunday, 9 o'clock New York time, 4 o'clock Israel time. I do Tanakh Talk, controversial issues, every Monday, 2 o'clock New York time, 9 o'clock Israel time. And I have a class on Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, 2:30 in the afternoon on Saturday, New York time, 9:30 at night, Israel time. I also have classes on conversion. Anyone has any questions, feel free. Find me on Facebook, Beyond Orthodox Conversion to Judaism. You can send me an email, rabbichaimkoffman@gmail.com, RABBICHAIMCOFFMAN @gmail.com.